It's raining on a tiny Greek island on the afternoon of October 20th, 1968. Inside a small candlelit chapel, a priest is getting ready for a wedding. And outside, standing in the wet, are about 50 journalists who've come across the water for one thing, a single look at the bride. Because the bride is the most famous woman on the planet. 2 children carry the candles into the chapel, a little boy, 7, a little girl, 10. And here's the first strange thing. Those 2 children are the son and daughter of a murdered American president. Their father was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And the woman about to get married, in secret, in the rain, on this rock in the sea, is Jacqueline Kennedy. So the question is, who does a woman like that marry? After the whole world watched her husband shot beside her in Dallas, who was the man waiting at the front of that chapel? His name is Aristotle Onassis. This is a man who built the biggest private fleet of ships on Earth, who married the most admired woman alive, right after the one Kennedy, who could have stopped it was gunned down in a hotel kitchen, who kept a mistress 2 streets from his wife, and who died with his own lawyers still writing up the divorce papers meant to humiliate her. None of that is an accident. All of it goes back to one afternoon when he was 16, watching his city burn. Let's start there. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Watched His City Burn. Aristotle Onassis was born around 1906 in a city called Smyrna in what's now Turkey. And I say around on purpose because even his birthday is a mystery. The record's burned. He gave different years on different passports. One historian thinks he quietly shaved a few years off to dodge the draft. Remember that? A man whose own birthday was up for negotiation. The habit of bending the facts to suit the moment started at the very beginning, and it never stopped. His father was a wealthy tobacco merchant. The boy grew up comfortable, safe, part of a Greek community that had lived on that coast for thousands of years. It felt permanent. Chapter 2. From refugee to the largest fleet on Earth. In 1923, this stateless kid gets on a boat to Argentina with, depending on who you believe, somewhere between $60 and $250 to his name. That's it. He works nights as a telephone operator. He runs a little tobacco business by day. And then watch how fast this goes. Within 6 years, he's an Argentine citizen. Not long after, he's got his first $1 million. Then he does the thing that makes him. It's the Great Depression. The whole world is terrified, and the price of ships has collapsed to almost nothing. And while everyone else is running for cover, Onassis buys. He picks up his first 6 cargo ships for pennies on the dollar. From there, it just climbs. Freighters, then oil tankers, then bigger tankers, then bigger ones. Until one year he orders 17 supertankers at once. 17. About 20 years after stepping off that boat with nothing, he owns the largest privately held shipping fleet on the planet. Writers compared it to a national navy. But here's the question you should be asking. How? How does that happen that fast, that clean? And the answer is, it wasn't clean. In 1950, the CIA started looking into Greek shipping magnates in New York who were moving cargo on American-built ships. Not just for America and its allies, for North Korea and China. During the Korean War, at its bloodiest, it ended in a settlement. In 1955, Onassis agreed to pay $7 million, and 6 of his companies pleaded guilty, but look closely at what happened to the man himself. Onassis walked away with no conviction on his own name. The corporations took the hit. The man stayed clean, and that became the blueprint for his whole life. Put the liability on the structure. Keep the man spotless. His companies were scattered across half a dozen countries, each picked to dodge a different tax or law. Depending on which document you read, Aristotle Onassis was 3 different people. That's $7 million fine, huge for its day. For him, it was a parking ticket. He'd learned in Smyrna the world could be bought out of. The US government had just proved it to him again, at scale. Chapter 3. The Floating Stage. Now that he had the money, he needed a stage, and he built one. He named it the Christina O after his daughter, and it wasn't really a yacht. It was a 500-foot advertisement for what unlimited money buys when a man stops caring what anyone thinks. He started with an old Canadian warship, bought for scrap price, then poured 4 years and millions into it. When most rich men measured their boats in a few dozen meters, this thing ran to about 150, with a crew of more than 50. Less a yacht than a private navy ship. Inside, a swimming pool whose mosaic floor rose up on hydraulics and turned into a dance floor. Taps that ran both fresh water and seawater. An operating room and a bar. And I have to tell you about the bar, because it tells you exactly who this man was. The footrest were made from the teeth of sperm whales. And the bar stools were covered in leather made from whale foreskin. Some of those whales came from his own fleet, the one the Peruvian Navy intercepted in 1954 for hunting in their waters, and fined him $3 million. Same story as always. Sail in, take what you want, until a navy shows up. So he hunted the whales, skinned them, upholstered his furniture in the most intimate part of them, and then built a little comedy routine out of making guests sit on it. He'd seat a famous woman, a Grace Kelly, a Greta Garbo, lean in, and tell her she was now sitting on the largest one in the world. And that's the man. On that boat, surrounded by famous people who were only there because he was paying for it, Aristotle Onassis became most completely himself. Everybody who stepped onto that deck became a prop in a show about him. But this floating stage was about to host one single cruise, one Mediterranean summer, that would blow up 2 marriages at the same time. Stick around. Chapter 4. The Voice He Broke. In 1957, at a party in Venice, Onassis met the most famous opera singer alive. Her name was Maria Callas. She was, at that point, probably the most disciplined artist in the world. That voice, the one that defined opera for a decade, wasn't a gift, it was built. Out of relentless work, isolation, a life organized entirely around the next performance. 2 years later, summer of 1959, Onassis arranged a cruise on the Christina O. On the guest list, Winston Churchill, Maria Callas, Callas's husband, and Onassis's own wife. By every account, the cruise is where the affair started. His own obituary put it bluntly, it began with gossip linking the two of them, and by the time it ended, both marriages were finished. Within weeks, Callas left her husband. The next year, Onassis's wife filed for divorce. But here's the tragedy underneath the romance. Watch what happened to that voice. Because the discipline that built it needed the old life, the rehearsal, the quiet, the calendar built around the music. And life with Onassis was nightclubs in Monte Carlo, and dinners on the yacht, and travel that ran on his schedule, never hers. By the early 1960s, critics who'd called her the greatest singer of her generation started writing about a decline they couldn't explain. But the cause wasn't a mystery. The cause was sitting in the front row at her performances. He had pulled her out of the only life that could sustain that voice, and the voice was giving out in response. She's the first woman in this story destroyed just by being near him, and she will not be the last. In fact, 16 years later, she'll still be there 2 streets from his deathbed. Remember her. Because Jackie is about to walk into the exact same trap. Chapter 5. Inside the Kennedy Orbit. So how does a Greek shipping tycoon end up inside America's most powerful family? The same way he got everywhere. Piece by piece. Person by person. First, before Jackie, there was her sister. Through the early 1960s, while Jacqueline Kennedy was First Lady, Onassis was having an affair with her younger sister Lee. That's well documented. and it put him right on the edge of the Kennedy world. The family hated it, Robert Kennedy especially. A lot of the juiciest quotes here rest on a single writer, so hold them loosely, but the hostility itself is all over the record. Then came Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. And here's a detail that stops you cold. On the night of the state funeral, while the nation was mourning its president, Aristotle Onassis was a guest inside the White House. He wasn't invited to Arlington. He didn't go to the service. He just sat in the nearly empty house while America mourned, and afterward was welcomed into the widow's private rooms. Why was he even there? Not because anyone wanted him. Because, as always, he'd made himself the man with the resources a grieving woman might need. There are even reports, from a single shaky source, that in the years after, cash moved toward Jackie in envelopes. The specific claim is thin, but the picture around it is solid. A president's widow, real money pressure, an expensive life to keep up, and a very rich man standing close by. It's the Smyrna lesson again, scaled up to the biggest stage on Earth. He spent his way into the room. He'd been doing it since 1922. Chapter 6. 4.5 months. Now I want to give you 2 dates, and I want you to just sit with the space between them. June 5th, 1968. In the kitchen corridor of a Los Angeles hotel, moments after winning the California primary, Robert Kennedy is shot. He dies the next day. He was 42. Whatever the truth of Bobby's relationship with Jackie, and there are ugly claims there that rest on a writer who's been thoroughly discredited, so I won't hand you certainty I haven't earned. One plain fact remains. His death removed the last Kennedy standing between Jackie and Aristotle Onassis. 4.5 months later, October 20th, 1968, she married him. 4.5 months. That gap is the whole story, and the people around her knew it. Jackie kept the decision so secret she told no one. Not even her own sister. Lee found out about the engagement not from Jackie, but from Onassis himself, who phoned her on holiday to invite her to the wedding. Think about what he was asking. Lee had been his lover. And now he was calling to ask her to come stand at the wedding of her own sister to him. She was so upset she called a friend and described it as a betrayal beyond imagination. And she came anyway. She stood there in that little rain-soaked chapel. And that wound between the sisters never fully healed. Decades later, when Jackie died, her will left Lee a single cold sentence and nothing else. The bride who told no one had planned exactly who would be informed and who would be shut out. In the engagement and in the will, the same silence both times, on purpose. Chapter 7. The 170 Clauses. Here's what you have to understand about that wedding. Jackie wasn't walking into a marriage. She was walking into a contract. And her own brother-in-law helped negotiate it. You've maybe heard the legend, the prenup with 170 clauses. Separate bedrooms in all 6 of their homes. A monthly cash allowance. A budget for round-the-clock bodyguards. A payout of millions if he ever divorced her. Now, be careful with that 170 number. It comes from a steward on the yacht who got bribed to sell his story, and Jackie's office called the whole thing fabricated. So the exact clauses, a servant's account. But, and this matters, an authenticated settlement document that later sold at auction proves a real agreement absolutely existed. So why would Jackie sign her life away like that? Cold, smart math. Under Greek law, a widow was automatically owed a fixed share of her husband's estate on a fortune worth around $500 million that would have come to about $62 million. By signing, she gave that up and took guaranteed cash now, plus a capped amount later. She was buying certainty at a discount. And why would a woman do that? Because she'd already sat in a passenger seat in Dallas and watched, in about 6 seconds, how fast a fortune turns into a widowhood. She was never going to trust an uncertain future again. But here's what all that money couldn't buy. The one thing the marriage was supposed to be about, his attention. Because his attention had belonged to someone else since 1959. Chapter 8. 2 streets apart. In Paris, Onassis kept an apartment, and a short walk away, same fashionable neighborhood, close enough to reach on foot, Maria Callas kept hers. According to his own personal secretary, the two of them never stopped seeing each other. Not after the affair began, not after the wedding. They couldn't stay apart, and the staff knew. All of them. His secretary described it. She'd call the house in the morning, and the staff would tell her, half laughing, that Mr. Onassis was very, very tired today. And when she asked why, Maria had come by overnight. Everyone in that house knew, including Jackie. She complained about it, quietly, to Onassis' own sister, and the advice she got, don't fight it, ignore it. So in public, Jackie stayed exactly the woman the cameras saw at the chapel, total control of her own face, giving nothing away. And I'll be honest, the cruelty in that household went well past an affair. There are darker allegations about medical staff Onassis kept on his payroll that I'll leave mostly alone because they're disturbing and some are contested. Just know the man was capable of real cruelty toward the women in his life, and the record on that runs deep. So picture it. Jackie had that clause, separate bedrooms in 6 houses, written right into her contract, and it was pointless. Because the bedroom that actually mattered was in an entirely different building. Chapter 9. The campaign to break her. And then it got worse. On the one patch of ground Jackie thought was completely private. In the early 1970s, on that island in the sea, a team of up to 10 photographers ran what can only be called an operation against her. According to the press at the time, they'd been hunting her for a year and a half, working out of motorboats, in wetsuits and diving gear, with underwater cameras, so they could surface near a shoreline she was sure no lens could ever reach. They caught her sunbathing, walking with no clothes on. The pictures ran first across 9 pages of a men's magazine in Rome. 3 years later, an American publisher bought the rights and ran them too. And that single issue sold out in days, jumping from a few thousand copies to over 2 million. It launched his whole empire. He called it the smartest money he ever spent. But here's the part that turns a violation into something much darker. Who set it up? One biographer names Onassis himself, says he'd gotten fed up paying for his wife's privacy lawsuits and cooked up a plan to embarrass her so completely the press would have nothing left to threaten her with, while wounding the woman he'd taken to sarcastically calling the widow. In that telling, the maps of the island and the schedule of where she'd be, all of it came from him. That's contested. One photographer's daughter says her father acted alone. So take it as what it is, a plausible, disputed claim. But strip away the old word scandal and look at what's left. Intimate photos of a woman, taken against her will, sold for profit across 2 countries, and if that biographer is right, arranged by her own husband to break her. And the most photographed woman of the century had no court on earth that could call those pictures back. So she absorbed it, in public, in silence. The campaign to break her would only end when grief broke her husband first. Chapter 10. The Curse. January 22nd, 1973. His only son, Alexander, 24 years old, the heir he had built the entire empire for, is in a small plane that crashes on takeoff in Athens. He dies the next day. And this is the thing all the money couldn't touch. It broke something in Onassis that never healed. But watch what he did with that grief. He didn't turn it inward, he turned it on his wife. In private, he started calling Jackie the witch, convinced she carried a curse. The first important man in her life died, he'd say, then the second. And now my own son is dead while she's my wife. His daughter Christina, who'd called Jackie a gold digger from day one, poured fuel on it. So he spent his last year trying to end the marriage as cruelly as he could. He hired a lawyer to draft the divorce, confirmed by the lawyer himself, one of the few hard facts in this whole part. He hired a detective to follow her. He wanted to divorce her, but only, in his own words, after he'd made it as humiliating as possible. And all the while, his own body was collapsing. He had a disease that strips your muscles of the ability to obey. In his final months, he appeared in public with his eyelids literally taped open because he could no longer lift them himself. Sit with that image. A man who spent his whole life arranging how other people would be seen, and at the end, he'd lost command of his own face. Chapter 11. 2 Widows, 1 Winner. Onassis died on March 15th, 1975. And here's the small, strange mercy in it. He died before he could file those divorce papers. So Jackie was still, technically, his widow. His willow was the last blow he aimed at her. He cut her down to the smallest amount Greek law would let him, a few million, and left the bulk to his daughter and a foundation in his dead son's name. Christina, who'd wanted Jackie gone since the wedding, fought her through lawyers for 2 years. In the end, Jackie walked away with about $26 million in exchange for giving up every other claim. It wasn't a victory. It was the price of leaving. But the real ending isn't about the money. It's a confession. According to Onassis' closest associate, in his final months, the man said it out loud. Maria Callas was the true love of his life. Marrying Jackie had been the supreme betrayal of Maria, and at the very moment his body gave out, he'd been planning to leave Jackie and go back to her. Callas outlived him by 2 years. She died alone in that Paris apartment at 53. Now set that beside what Jackie said in public when he died. She said Onassis had rescued her when her life was engulfed in shadows. That they'd shared beautiful experiences. That she'd be eternally grateful. Read it again. Not one word about love. Not one syllable about grief. Nothing anyone could ever quote against her. It reads like it was written by a lawyer, because that's who Jackie was. The man spent his whole life controlling what the world was allowed to see of him, and in the end he was outmatched by a woman whose discretion was the equal of his appetites. She lived 19 more years, and in her final months, dying, she did one last thing. She burned her own letters and photographs, by hand. A friend once said Jackie had 3 lives, a public one, a private one, and a secret one. The burning was her last edit. She made sure only the first one survived her, so think back to that rainy chapel in 1968. 2 children carrying candles. The most famous woman in the world, marrying a man nobody could understand her choosing. Now you know what she was walking into. And what it cost, the singer whose voice he broke, the son he buried, the sister he turned into a stranger, the wife he tried to humiliate right up until the day he died. He spent people his entire life. He learned it at 16, on the deck of a ship, watching his city burn, and he never once unlearned it. So here's my question for you. Between the man with the endless appetite and the woman who never lost control of a single word, who do you think actually won? Tell me in the comments. And if this one got under your skin, stay with me, the next story is even stranger. It's a clear night over Chicago in the summer of 1930. And down on the street, a 4-year-old boy is staring straight up at the sky. A beam of white light, impossibly bright, is sweeping across the darkness above him, turning night into something closer to day. People will later swear that if you stood still and let it pass over you, you could read a newspaper by it. That's how strong this thing is. The boy doesn't know it yet, but he's looking at a monument to purity. A light built by a soap company on top of a building built by a soap company to prove to the whole city that clean living and bright light go hand in hand. That boy's name is Hugh Hefner, and 35 years from this exact night, he's going to buy the building underneath that light and turn it into the headquarters of Playboy magazine. So what happened in between? And why, to this day, is that same beacon still burning up there, but locked so it can never shine into the city again? Let's start on the night it was born. Chapter 1. The man who wanted to clean the world. Long before there was a beacon, before there was a skyscraper, before there was even a city block waiting on North Michigan Avenue, there was just one immigrant kid with an idea nobody had really tried before. In 1806, a young Englishman named William Colgate arrived in New York with almost nothing. Back then, soap wasn't really a product. It was a mess. You bought it in a big greasy block, cut by hand, sold by weight, no two pieces quite the same. William looked at that and saw an opportunity nobody else did. He started selling soap as individual, uniform cakes. Clean, wrapped, consistent, every single time. That sounds simple now. In the 1800s, it was close to revolutionary. He wasn't just selling soap anymore. He was selling the idea that cleanliness itself could be reliable. Something you could trust, the same way every single time you bought it. From there, the business exploded. He partnered with his brothers, expanded from soap into perfume, and within a few decades, his company was the largest fragrance maker in the entire country. He was a deeply religious man. People close to him actually called him the Deacon, and he gave away close to half of everything he earned. Some of that money helped found a small seminary in New York that would later be renamed in his honor, Colgate University. By the 1840s, William's company had grown so large that the boiling vats needed for production could no longer fit on his property in Manhattan. He had to move the entire operation across the river into a sprawling new facility in Jersey City. Picture that for a second. A business that started with one man and a handful of soap molds had grown so large in a single generation that it outgrew an entire borough of New York. When William died in 1857, at the age of 74, he left behind a wife of 46 years and 3 sons. And one of them, Samuel, is the man you need to remember. Because Samuel is the one who understood something his father never lived to see, that cleanliness wasn't just soap anymore. It was teeth. It was breath. It was the entire human body. In 1873, Samuel's company introduced something brand new, toothpaste, packed into small glass jars. Then, in 1896, they went even further, the world's first mass-produced toothpaste in a collapsible metal tube. The kind you squeeze. The kind that's still sitting in your bathroom right now. By the time Samuel died in 1897, the Colgate name wasn't just a company anymore. It was becoming a symbol, a promise that dirt, disease, and decay could all be pushed back, one bar of soap, one tube of toothpaste at a time. But here's the thing about empires built on a single idea. Eventually, someone else has the same idea. And out in the Midwest, 2 rival companies were about to force Colgate into a decision that would change the skyline of an entire city. Chapter 2: The Tower Without a Shadow. By the 1920s, the soap business had turned into a war. Up in Milwaukee, a company called Palmolive had built its own empire on a green soap made from palm and olive oil. Down in Kansas City, the Peet brothers dominated the laundry aisle. And standing over all of them, circling like a shark, was Procter & Gamble, a competitor big enough to threaten to swallow everyone else whole. So the smaller players did the only thing that made sense. They stopped fighting each other and merged. Colgate, Palmolive, and Peet combined into one company, and almost overnight, it became the 3rd largest consumer goods company in the entire United States. But a company that size needed something it didn't have one single headquarters, powerful enough to represent all 3 names under one roof. And the location the new leadership picked shocked people. They chose North Michigan Avenue. At the time, this was nowhere. Quiet, low, mostly residential, nothing like the busy streets deep in Chicago's Loop, where all the real business happened. Building a skyscraper there wasn't just risky. To a lot of people, it looked like a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a bet that this quiet street was about to become something bigger, and the architects hired to build it, Holabird and Root, didn't just want to put up a tall building. They wanted to make a statement against everything skyscrapers had become. At the time, New York's towers were loud, covered in carved gargoyles, wrapped in ornate metal crowns built to show off. Holabird and Root wanted the exact opposite. They called their approach disciplined verticality. Every window, every column, every line of stone engineered to pull your eye straight upward, with nothing sticking out to break the flow. They even banned exterior fire escapes, just to keep the surface perfectly smooth. And here's where it gets strange. The building wasn't just designed to look tall, it was designed not to cast a shadow. Back then, people genuinely associated darkness with disease. A city block without sunlight meant dampness, soot, sickness. And for a company built entirely around the idea of cleanliness, a building that blocked out the sun would have been the ultimate contradiction. So the architects used Chicago's new zoning laws to pull the building's mass back from the street in a series of dramatic setbacks at the 3rd floor, the 11th, the 18th, the 22nd, each one stepping the tower back like a staircase reaching toward the sky. They called it the shadowless design. Sunlight and fresh air from Lake Michigan were meant to pour straight down onto the sidewalk, no matter how tall the tower grew. It was elegant. It was disciplined. It was, in every sense, a monument to purity. Even the ground floor carried the same message. Step inside, and the lobby felt less like an office building and more like a quiet cathedral, walls lined with dark, polished stone, cut so carefully that every grain in the rock ran straight upward, echoing the same vertical lines climbing all the way up outside. Even the floor pattern below your feet mirrored the shape of the tower above you. Nothing in this building was accidental. Every surface, every line, every angle was pointing the same direction, up toward the light. But the tower still had one thing missing. Something waiting up at the very top. Something that would turn this quiet soap company's office building into the single brightest object in the entire Chicago sky. Chapter 3. The light no one wanted. Here's a detail almost nobody knows. The massive beacon that would eventually crown this building, the thing that made it famous, wasn't even supposed to go here. It was originally planned for the roof of a different building entirely, a hotel across the city, built specifically to compete with a rival tower's rooftop beam. Only at the last minute did the plan change, and the light ended up here instead, 600 feet above North Michigan Avenue. It was a gift to the city from a wealthy inventor named Elmer Sperry, and it was built to honor one man. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator alive, fresh off his solo flight across the Atlantic. They called it the Lindbergh Beacon. In August of 1930, the moment came to switch it on, and the ceremony itself was pure theater. President Herbert Hoover sat at a desk inside the White House and pressed a button. That button didn't turn the light on directly. It sent a tiny electrical pulse racing across the country through telegraph lines, all the way to Chicago, where it tripped a heavy magnetic switch inside the tower. That switch snapped shut, and 2 billion candle power of white light exploded across the Chicago sky for the very first time. People said you could see it from 300 miles away. Some claimed that if the beam stopped rotating and held steady, you could read a printed newspaper by its light from 27 miles out. Whether every one of those stories was exactly true almost doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it, because that's how impossibly bright this thing seemed. But here's the twist nobody expected. The one person the entire ceremony was built to honor didn't show up. Charles Lindbergh was invited by telegram. He said no. He never explained himself publicly, but people close to him said he thought the whole idea was backwards. That a beacon like this belonged out on a dark runway, guiding pilots home, not spinning over the middle of a crowded city. He wanted nothing to do with the spectacle built in his name, and it wasn't just Lindbergh who had a problem with it. The wealthy Chicagoans living in the buildings nearby were furious. The light was so strong it cut straight through their bedroom curtains at night. A building constructed to represent purity and public good had just built the single most intrusive object in the entire skyline, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Maintaining a light like that wasn't simple, either. A dedicated technician had to ride a tiny one-person elevator all the way up the tower, step out into the open wind 600 feet above the street, and manually change the carbon rods that kept the beam burning. Every single night, someone had to climb up into the sky just to keep that promise of purity glowing. For over a decade, that light kept turning, night after night, watching over a city that both loved it and resented it. Until one day, the country went to war and the light went dark. Chapter 4: The Blackout. When the United States entered World War II, the Navy made a decision. A beam that powerful, visible from hundreds of miles away, wasn't a landmark anymore. It was a target, something an enemy aircraft could use to find the city in the dark. So the order came down, and the beacon was switched off. Think about what that meant. A tower built on the promise of never casting a shadow was now standing completely dark by its own choice, because the world outside had become too dangerous for that kind of light to keep shining. Not long after, Colgate-Palmolive sold the building outright to raise money for the war effort, though the company stayed on for years afterward as a tenant. And as the post-war years rolled on, the company slowly shifted its real power out to New Jersey, where it already had a massive corporate campus. Chicago simply wasn't necessary anymore. The building that had once been the pride of North Michigan Avenue quietly faded into just another office tower. The beacon stayed dark for years. The name on the door barely mattered to anyone outside the building. And then, in 1965, a man walked back onto that street. Not a soap executive. Not an architect. A magazine publisher who, 35 years earlier, had stood on a Chicago sidewalk as a small boy, staring up at that exact light. He wasn't there to look at it this time. He was there to buy it. Chapter 5: The Man Who Bought Purity. Ask yourself a question. Out of every building in Chicago, why would Hugh Hefner choose this one? The tower built by a soap company. The tower engineered specifically to represent cleanliness, discipline, and moral good. Why take the one building in the entire city practically designed to be his opposite and put his name on top of it? Maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. Hefner grew up on Chicago's west side, and by his own account, he used to watch that beacon sweep across the night sky and feel something close to wonder. To him, it wasn't a symbol of soap. It was a symbol of glamour, of reaching the top, of having arrived. Decades later, once he actually had the money and the fame, he went straight for the one building that had lit up his imagination as a kid. In 1965, Hefner signed a lease on the building for close to $2 million and renamed it the Playboy Building. And by this point, the timing made perfect sense. His original Playboy Club was already just a few blocks away on Walton Street, so moving his headquarters here wasn't a random choice. It put the entire empire on one of the most prestigious blocks in the city. Then came the transformation. Crews gutted multiple floors, stripping away the old conservative office aesthetic and replacing it with something built entirely around image and indulgence. Massive illuminated letters spelling out the Playboy name went up on the roofline, visible across the skyline, right where the beacon had once stood alone. And strangely, in the middle of all that change, some of the original 1929 craftsmanship never left. The rich, hand-carved French mahogany paneling from the building's earliest days, installed originally for soap executives, stayed exactly where it was. Hefner simply built his new world around it. A wet bar here, a screening room there, the old shell of purity, quietly wrapped around something completely different on the inside. Lower floors were converted into photography studios with custom lighting rigs. Behind locked doors sat secured darkrooms, used only to develop and archive the magazine's negatives, spaces nobody outside a small circle of staff was ever allowed to enter. And tucked away on one floor was a private lounge reserved exclusively for the company's most exclusive models. A quiet space to relax between shifts at the club next door, hidden from public view entirely. Even the office layout told the story. Floors that had once held shipping and accounting departments were now filled with custom-built egg chairs and semi-enclosed listening pods, complete with high-fidelity speakers built right into the headrest, spaces designed purely for pleasure, sitting on top of floors that had once been reserved for legal paperwork and international logistics. A building that once prided itself on total transparency, designed so precisely that it wouldn't even cast a shadow, was now, floor by floor, filling up with rooms built specifically to stay hidden. And the most private room of all wasn't down on those lower floors. It was all the way at the top, right underneath the very beacon that started this whole story. Chapter 6. The room at the top. The top 3 floors of the tower had always been something special. Back in the Colgate days, this space was reserved for visiting executives, soaring ceilings, private terraces built right into the building's step-back setbacks, huge windows looking straight out over Lake Michigan. Hefner claimed all 3 of those floors for himself. Picture it, 14-foot ceilings. That same carved mahogany paneling from decades earlier, still standing, still gleaming. But now surrounded by pool tables, a private screening room, wet bars tucked into corners that had never held anything stronger than a soap executive's afternoon coffee. This was the highest, most private space in the entire building, and by extension, one of the most private rooms in the entire city. A space built originally so soap barons could look out over a healthy sunlit Chicago now hosted parties that the rest of the world only ever heard rumors about. Nobody outside a tight circle really knew what happened up there. That was the point. A tower engineered from its very foundation to be transparent, to never hide anything, not even a shadow, had, at its absolute peak, become the single most closed-off, secretive space in the whole building. And for close to 2 decades, that space stayed exactly like that. Untouchable. Legendary. The heart of an empire. But no empire built entirely on image lasts forever. And this one was about to run straight into a problem money alone couldn't fix. Chapter 7. When the lights went out again. By the 1980s, the world had started catching up to Playboy. Competing magazines were pushing harder, going further, cutting into a market Hefner once had almost entirely to himself. The company needed cash, and one of the easiest ways to get it was to sell off what it owned. So in 1980, Playboy sold the building's lease outright, but signed a 10-year deal to stay on as a tenant, buying themselves one more decade in the tower that had defined the entire company's image. That decade ran out fast. When the lease finally expired, Playboy didn't renew. Instead, the company packed up and moved into a smaller, far more modest office along Lakeshore Drive. In 1989, the editorial staff cleared out for good. And here's the detail that says everything. The massive illuminated letters spelling out Playboy, the same letters that had once dominated the Chicago skyline, impossible to miss from almost anywhere downtown, were quietly taken down. No ceremony. No crowd. Nothing like the spectacle that had switched the beacon on 60 years earlier. Just workers and a rooftop, and a name disappearing one letter at a time. The building's new owners moved fast to erase what came before. They renamed it simply by its street address. Nothing about soap, nothing about the magazine, just a number. It was a deliberate move, an attempt to strip away decades of reputation in one legal document, so the building could finally attract ordinary corporate tenants again, without the weight of everything it used to represent. For years after that, it functioned as a fairly ordinary, slightly dated office building. Nobody outside real estate circles paid it much attention anymore. The beacon, by this point, had already gone dark for good. Complaints from nearby residents about lights spilling into their windows had finally won out, and in the early 1980s, The original beam was switched off for the last time. Eventually, it was donated to an aviation museum where it still sits today, the same light that once burned brighter than anything else in the city, now just an exhibit behind glass. But a building carrying two entirely different reputations, one built on purity, one built on scandal, doesn't just fade away quietly. Eventually, someone was going to look at that tower and see something the rest of the city had forgotten it still had. Chapter 8. The light that's only allowed to point one way. At the turn of the millennium, the city finally recognized what it had. In 2000, the building was named an official Chicago landmark. 3 years later, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Legally, this tower could never be torn down, never stripped for parts, never allowed to just quietly vanish. Then, in 2001, a developer bought the entire tower and did something that, 20 years earlier, would have seemed impossible. He converted it into more than 100 ultra-luxury residential condominiums. The soap headquarters. The Playboy headquarters. Now, simply home. One of the earliest owners of that legendary top-floor penthouse was Chicago-born actor Vince Vaughn, who bought the space in 2006. He tried for years to sell it as one massive unit, and for years, nobody would take it. It was simply too large, too unusual for most buyers to want as a single home. Eventually, he split it into separate units, and only then did it finally sell. Even the building itself, it turns out, couldn't stay whole forever. Everything about it kept getting divided, renamed, and reshaped, piece by piece, floor by floor, depending on whoever needed to make sense of it next. And then came the beacon. In 2007, to mark the building's restoration, a new light was installed at the very top, almost 80 years after the first one had ever switched on. But this time, it wasn't allowed to do what it once did. The original beacon used to sweep in a full circle, blasting light across the entire city, bright enough to cut through bedroom curtains for miles around. This new one doesn't get that freedom. It's locked. It only sweeps back and forth over one direction, straight out toward the water. It never turns back toward the city again. Think about that for a second. The very first version of this light was built to announce something to the entire world. First purity, then later, an empire of a completely different kind. But the version standing up there right now has been quietly told to look the other way. Away from the city. Away from the people who once fought over what it represented. Out toward the lake, where there's nothing left to argue with. So go back to that summer night in 1930. A 4-year-old boy on a Chicago sidewalk, staring straight up at a beam of light strong enough, they said, to read a newspaper by. He had no idea what that tower below the light actually stood for. He just knew it was the brightest thing he'd ever seen. Now you know the rest. A soap company that built a tower specifically so it would never cast a shadow. A beacon nobody wanted, dedicated to a man who refused to even show up. A penthouse that went from soap executives to secret parties to an actor who couldn't sell it fast enough. And a light that, after everything, was finally allowed back on, but only if it promised never to shine into the city again. So here's my question for you. Was this ever really a building about purity that got hijacked by scandal? Or was it always a building about image? About controlling exactly what the world was allowed to see, and it just changed hands from one master of image to another? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this one pulled you in, stick around. The next story is even stranger. Here is a number that has never quite added up. On the 14th of April, 1902, a 26-year-old turned the key on a one-room store in a coal town in western Wyoming. And by the time he shut it that night, the drawer held $41. The histories quote that figure like a triumph. It isn't. Look closer, and it reads like the last page of something, not the first. because the man behind that counter should not have been there at all. The doctor had already told him his lungs were finished. He had borrowed the money simply to stand in that room. He could not afford most of the goods stacked on his own shelves. So how does a man who was sick, broke, and betting on a town almost nobody had heard of end up with his name over stores in all 50 states? And then, almost exactly 118 years later, watch the whole thing collapse into bankruptcy. That is the mystery. It runs through a lost fortune, a hymn in a dark hallway, and a young clerk named Sam Walton. And it starts here in Kemmerer. Start with a thing that makes no sense. A store that took only cash, in a town that ran entirely on debt, should have died inside a month. This one didn't. To understand why, you have to understand the trap the whole town was built inside. Kemmerer was barely 5 years old when Penney arrived. Coal had been struck in the ground in 1897, and a settlement went up around the mines almost before anyone thought to plan it. 1,000 people, most of them either underground or married to a man who was, and a railroad running straight through the middle, hauling the coal out and the supplies in. The families along that line needed work clothes and dry goods. What they could almost never find was an honest price. Retail then ran on two things: credit and haggling. A merchant would size up whoever walked through his door and quietly set the price to match what he guessed they could pay. The mining company kept its own store and handed out credit like water, which sounds generous until you follow the money. Wages left through one door and came back through another. A man could work an entire season and finish it owing the company more than he had earned. Everyone in town could do that arithmetic. Almost nobody escaped it. This was the world Penney stepped into, and crucially, he did not step into it as an owner. He came as a junior partner. Two older merchants, Guy Johnson and Thomas Callahan, ran a small string of shops under the name Golden Rule, and Penney had clerked for them long enough to earn a piece of the next one. He argued, deliberately, for a town too small to tempt any real competitor, somewhere he could learn every customer by name. His 1/3 share cost $2,000, and most of it was borrowed, some of it from his own wife's father. If the store failed, he was finished before he had truly begun. Their entire life fit into the space over the shop. Then he did the thing the town had never been offered. Before opening, he walked the length of Kemmerer on foot, taking stock of what the place actually lacked. And when he set out his goods, every single item wore one price, marked in plain sight. The same price for everyone who came through the door. No haggling, no credit. If you had the cash, you paid what the tag said. If you didn't, you came back when you could. The method did not begin in Wyoming. To find its source, you have to go back to a farmhouse outside Hamilton, Missouri, and to a father who taught it as something closer to religion than to business. James Cash Penney was named for that father, a farmer who preached on Sundays without pay and ran his household as though comfort itself were a temptation to be resisted. He belonged to a strict Baptist sect, and he believed a boy came to understand the worth of $1 only by being made to earn it. So when James turned 8, he was told that from then on he would buy his own clothes. It was not cruelty. It was doctrine. The boy raised pigs and traded horses and earned what he needed one small sale at a time, and the lessons set like concrete. Money was a thing to be respected, never assumed. Then his father made one last arrangement on his behalf. He asked a merchant in town to take the boy on and teach him the dry goods trade. James started behind the counter early in 1895. Weeks later, his father died. By the account handed down through the family, the old man said near the end that Jim would make something of himself and then did not live to find out whether he was right. James was 19, and the one man whose approval he had chased his whole life was gone. The Countess suited him in a way the farm never had. He was shy at first, and older clerks outsold him easily. But he studied selling the way other men studied scripture, and within a year or two, he was outselling everyone in the store. Selling, he decided, was not a gift a person was born with. It was a craft, and he meant to master it. Then his own body turned on him. A doctor found the early signs of tuberculosis and warned him, in the blunt language of the era, that if he stayed in the damp Missouri air, he would not last. He needed high ground and dry heat. He needed the West. And here is the irony the whole story hangs on. The illness that was supposed to end him is the only reason any of the rest of it ever happened. In 1897, at 21, he left for Colorado with almost nothing and very nearly finished what the disease had started. He sank his small savings into a butcher shop, and the butcher shop failed. What pulled him back from the edge was a clerking job at a small chain nearby, one that happened to be called Golden Rule. The name would have rung a bell. It was his father's pulpit principle, lettered now over a shop door. Johnson and Callahan spotted in him exactly what his first employer had, and in 1899, they handed him their store in Evanston, Wyoming, to manage. $50 a month, plus a share of the profit. That same year, he married Berta Alva Hess in Cheyenne. At 23, he was suddenly answerable for a store and a wife, standing on solid ground for the first time. Evanston prospered under him, and the owners took note. Soon they would put something bigger in front of him, a store he could own a real share of in a town of his own choosing. And you already know the town he picked. Here is the part that should not be possible. In the very years a lesser man would have been flattened by grief, Penney grew his chain faster than any competitor in the country. The explanation is a single structural trick that most retailers never dare to try. Most men who build a chain of stores hire managers to run them. Penney did the opposite. He turned his managers into owners. And he did it because it had been done to him. Johnson and Callahan had made him a partner rather than a hired hand, and it had changed how hard he was willing to work. He never forgot the difference, so he simply ran the same logic forward. A manager who proved himself was not merely promoted. He was given a 1/3 stake in the next store that opened, and a share of everything it earned. Follow the incentives, and the whole machine reveals itself. A man who owned a piece of his store worked it like an owner because he was one. A manager who trained a promising clerk had every reason to train him well, because when that clerk was ready to run a store of his own, the man who taught him took a share of that one too. Good managers produced more good managers. The chain, in effect, grew itself. In 1913, he brought the stores under one name at last, the J.C. Penney Company, and wrote down the principles it would live by, 7 of them in all. Most were what you would expect, about serving the customer and packing real value into every dollar. But the core was a pledge to reward the people who did the work, and every proposed policy faced one final test before it was adopted. Was it fair? And was it honest? If the answer was no, the idea went no further. The following year, he moved the head office to New York, closer to the markets and the makers. By then, the chain had spread far past the coal camps into farm towns and county seats across the middle of the country. There had been 34 stores in 1912. Within 15 years, there would be more than 1,000. But the years that built all of this were brutal to him at home. In the winter of 1910, his wife Berta went into a Salt Lake City hospital for a minor operation and caught pneumonia there. 2 days after Christmas, still in her 30s, she was gone. She had gone in for something small and simply had not come home. Left with 2 young sons and a grief he had no idea how to carry, Penney did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. The endless business of opening stores filled the space she had left, and that is the hard truth buried in the record. The empire of 1,000 partners grew fastest in the very years after he lost the one partner he had actually wanted to keep. By degrees, he began to step back. In 1917, at 42, he set down the presidency and became chairman, handing the daily running of the company to a steady, gifted man named Earl Sams, who had come up through the ranks and knew the business cold. By the mid-1920s, the company more or less ran itself. Sams minded the stores, the partners minded their towns, and Penney, not yet 50, and wealthier than a preacher's son had any right to dream, found himself with time on his hands, wondering what a fortune like his was actually for. But the years that built all of this were brutal to him at home. In the winter of 1910, his wife Berta went into a Salt Lake City hospital for a minor operation and caught pneumonia there. 2 days after Christmas, still in her 30s, she was gone. She had gone in for something small and simply had not come home. Left with 2 young sons and a grief he had no idea how to carry, Penney did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. The endless business of opening stores filled the space she had left, and that is the hard truth buried in the record. The empire of 1,000 partners grew fastest in the very years after he lost the one partner he had actually wanted to keep. By degrees, he began to step back. In 1917, at 42, he set down the presidency and became chairman, handing the daily running of the company to a steady, gifted man named Earl Sams, who had come up through the ranks and knew the business cold. By the mid-1920s, the company more or less ran itself. Sams minded the stores, the partners minded their towns, and Penney, not yet 50, and wealthier than a preacher's son had any right to dream, found himself with time on his hands, wondering what a fortune like his was actually for. Almost everyone knows the stores. Almost no one knows that Penney built a town, a real one, with a charter and a post office, and that this forgotten place holds the key both to who he was and to the debt that would one day destroy him. The answer to what a fortune was for turned out not to be a yacht or a stable of racehorses. It was 120,000 acres of raw pine and scrub in northern Florida. In 1922, Penney and a partner named Ralph Gwynn bought an enormous, cheap tract in Clay County. Florida in those years was gripped by a land mania, and most of the men buying were speculators holding ground only to flip it as prices climbed. That was never his intention. His idea was stranger and more like him, not to spend the fortune, but to plant it. What he built was a farming community run on the same principle as his stores. Instead of renting to tenants, he let farmers work the land and earn a stake in what they grew, the way his managers earned a stake in what they sold. Experts cleared the ground and laid out demonstration plots to prove what the soil could do. An Institute of Applied Agriculture brought in specialists and opened its doors to any farmer who wanted the newest methods. It was the golden rule again, argued this time in soil across 100,000 acres. Give people a fair start, and they will rise to meet it. But the piece he cared about most was not for farmers at all. In 1926 he built, inside the larger settlement, a ring of cottages around a stone chapel raised in memory of his mother and father. the memorial home community, meant for old ministers and missionaries who had given their whole lives to the church and finished with almost nothing. The line back to his own father is impossible to miss. The Reverend Penney had preached for no pay and died with little, and here was his son building rent-free homes for exactly the kind of worn-out country preacher the old man had been. In time, hundreds would spend their last years there. By 1928, the kingdom was as complete as it would ever be. And here is the detail the whole next chapter turns on. Every cleared acre and every prize cow rested on two things: his own fortune and his willingness to borrow against it. He had built an entire world on the quiet assumption that the good years would simply keep coming. There was a little more than a year left. Now the paradox that defines the man's life. When the crash came, the company he had built barely felt it. The man who built it lost everything he owned. Both of those things are true at once, and the reason they are both true is the key to understanding him. The company was almost accidentally crash-proof. It took only cash, so no customer default could touch it. It carried no debt, so no bank could call one in. It sold cheap, useful goods that people still needed precisely when money was tight. While far bigger names folded, the chain kept right on opening stores through the worst of it, passing 1,400 by the middle of the 1930s. And that was its own particular cruelty. The thing he had made was thriving. His name over 1,000 doors, the idea he had bet his life on proving itself in exactly the crisis it was built for. And none of it belonged to him anymore in any way that could save him. Because to pay for Florida and everything around it, Penney had borrowed heavily against his own company stock. Millions of dollars of it. As long as the stock held its value, the loans were safe. And why would a man so careful with a company be so reckless with himself? Because the stock had only ever moved one way. For 20 years it had climbed. Every time he borrowed against it to build another good thing, the rising value covered the debt and left him richer than before. Borrowing had never once cost him anything. He simply never pictured a year in which it might. Then came 1929. Penny stock, which the company had only just sold to the public that year, fell from more than $100 a share to about $13. The banks wanted their money, and the shares no longer came close to covering the loans. Everything he owned was suddenly tied to values disappearing by the day. And here is the joke at the center of it, too bitter to be funny. For 30 years, Penney had preached a single sermon to America: pay cash, and owe no man anything you cannot cover. His stores lived by that rule, and it was saving them now. But the man himself had done the exact opposite. Mortgaged his life's work to the hilt, and the very debt he had spent a career warning against was about to swallow him whole. The golden rule man had become, in the plainest terms, a debtor, and the shame of that may have cut deeper than the loss. What followed was not one dramatic collapse, but a slow bleeding out. Month after month, through 1930, and into the year after, he sat across desks from bankers and sold off pieces of his life. The detail that stings most is what happened to Penney Farms. The whole idealistic experiment had to be broken up and sold, and he let the land go until only a couple hundred acres remained, which he deeded to the retired ministers, so that at least the old preachers could keep their homes. The thing he had built to outlast him was dismantled inside a year. By the time the fall was complete, a man of 56 who had once been worth $40 million owed $7 million he did not have. That much could be counted. What could not be counted was the sleeplessness that came next, the worry that would not switch off, and something deeper underneath both that he could not even name. The losses themselves he might have survived. What they were doing to him was another matter. Chapter 6. The Man Who Would Not Retire. Now for the comeback that should not have been possible. A ruined man of 56, deep in debt, who not only climbed all the way back, but then refused, for the next 40 years, to stop working. The question worth holding is not just how he recovered the money. It is why, once he had, he kept standing behind a counter into his 90s when he never again had to. The climb took most of a decade, and he made it the only way he knew. One piece at a time. The company kept thriving through the Depression, and as it did, the value of the stock he had managed to hold on to began to climb back. He paid down what he owed steadily, the way he had earned everything since he was a boy, and by the second half of the 1930s, the debt was gone, and much of the fortune had returned. He was wealthy again, but he never again spoke of money as though it were the point. It went where it had always gone, into other people, through a foundation and into churches, schools and young men trying to make their way as he once had. He died on the 12th of February, 1971, in New York, at the age of 95. His friend Norman Vincent Peale spoke at the funeral. He had lived through more change than almost any man alive. Born into a world of horses and coal towns, dead in the age of jet planes and suburban malls, his own name hanging over hundreds of them. By then the company was the 5th largest retailer in the country, past 1,600 stores. The boy who once could not afford his own shoes had built a name known in every corner of America, lost it, and won it back, and he died a contented old man, believing the company he had built would go on forever. For a while, it looked as though he was right. The discount retail model popularized by Walmart later became one of the biggest competitive pressures facing Penney. For a while, after Penney was gone, the company only grew. It reached its greatest size in 1973 with more than 2,000 stores. The discount stores that Walton had helped unleash took the budget shoppers first. Then came online shopping and the slow death of the shopping mall, on which Penney's had staked nearly everything. By 2006, the company was selling around $20 billion a year. Within a decade and a half, that number had roughly halved. In 2011, reaching for a savior, the board responded to pressure from the activist investor Bill Ackman and brought in Ron Johnson, the executive who had built Apple's dazzling retail stores. He swept away the endless coupons and sales that penny shoppers had come to love and replaced them with everyday low prices. Simple, clear, no games. And he did all of it without once testing whether the customers actually wanted any of it. But Penney's customers were no longer frontier miners. They had been trained for decades to hunt for coupons and to chase the small thrill of a sale, and when the sales vanished, they felt cheated and they left. In a single year, the company's sales fell by a quarter, $4.5 billion simply gone. Johnson was out within 17 months, but the damage held. The company that had survived the Great Depression could not survive its own reinvention. The company cycled through chief executives and strategies, none of which worked, losing money almost every year and sitting under close to $5 billion in debt. The end, when it came fast. In early 2020, the coronavirus pandemic shut the doors of nearly every store in the country, and for a company already this weak, it was the final blow. In May 2020, after 118 years, JCPenney filed for bankruptcy and was taken off the New York Stock Exchange after 91 years. The store count, more than 2,000 at its peak, had fallen to 846. What remained was bought out of bankruptcy by two of the country's largest mall landlords for around $800 million. And there is one last detail that closes the circle completely. On the list of stores to be auctioned off in the bankruptcy sat a small store in Kemmerer, Wyoming. The Mother Store, the original single room that had opened on the 14th of April, 1902, and had never once closed its doors in all the years since. It had been 118 years since a sick young man rang up $3,341 in that room and let himself believe he could build something that would last. He had been right, and then he had been wrong. And now the proof of both was up for sale. By the mid-1950s, one stretch of mountains 90 miles from New York City held more than 500 resorts, 50,000 bungalows, and 1 million visitors every summer. By some accounts, the densest concentration of resort hotels anywhere on Earth. Today, almost none of it exists, not as businesses, not as buildings you could point to on a map. What's left is ruins in second-growth forest, collapsed ballrooms open to the sky, empty swimming pools with birch trees rising through shattered tile. The gap between 1 million guests and an empty forest isn't one failed business. It's an industry built twice in the same mountains and abandoned twice for entirely different reasons, a century apart. It starts with a story about a man who slept for 20 years. Washington Irving published Rip Van Winkle in 1819 and set it in the Catskills, a hazy blue range west of the Hudson, populated in his telling by the ghosts of Henry Hudson's Dutch crew, bowling ninepins in the thunder while a lazy villager slept the revolution away. Irving had barely set foot in these mountains. What he wrote anyway was a founding myth for a range that, until then, had no myth at all. Within a few years, the Catskills weren't hills west of the river. They were the wilderness, the first American landscape famous enough to draw visitors who'd never read the book that made it so. Something had to receive them. In 1824, a group of businessmen opened the Catskill Mountain House on an escarpment ledge more than 2,000 feet above the valley. The first mountain resort built anywhere in the United States. A long white building fronted by tall columns, set on the lip of a cliff with nothing beneath its porch but air, and most summer mornings cloud. It wasn't a hotel so much as a viewing platform that happened to serve dinner. Then, in 1825, a young painter came up the same river. Thomas Cole traveled toward the escarpment and began painting these mountains in roughly the register Irving had already written them in vast, older than the country that had just discovered them. The canvases became the founding documents of the Hudson River School, the first art movement America could claim entirely as its own. Frederick Church, Cole's most prominent student, climbed the ledge in 1849 and painted the view at sunrise from the hotel's own porch, the columns just visible at the frame's edge, the valley beneath drowned in white. In 30 years, a single hotel porch produced a national myth, a resort industry, and a school of painting. That made the Catskills famous. What came next made them exclusive. And that's where the story turns. By the 1880s, the Mountain House had become a fixture of American public life. 3 presidents made the climb Grant, Arthur, Roosevelt, fixing the ledge on the national map. The advertisements these hotels ran in New York papers read like ordinary resort copy. Mountain air, private baths, an orchestra on the lawn, and one more line, printed often enough to be settled house policy rather than one owner's preference. No Hebrews or consumptives. The phrase did two jobs in one sentence. Consumptives, tuberculosis patients, were refused rooms for fear of contagion. Hebrews were refused because they were Jewish, a category the management found equally undesirable and advertised with the same flat certainty. Beside the room rates, beside the train schedules, here's what makes that line the hinge of this entire story. New York City, in these same decades, held one of the largest Jewish populations on Earth. And the resort world 90 miles north was, by its own printed terms, closed to all of it. Those families didn't stop wanting mountains. They started looking at land nobody advertising a resort had ever thought worth mentioning. The poorer, rockier country south and west, in Sullivan and Ulster counties. Ground too thin for the hotel trade the Hudson side had already perfected. Keep the mountain house on its ledge in mind. Its part in this isn't finished. What exclusion built instead on farmland nobody wanted would take a name of its own within a generation. And that name didn't come from a lawyer, a painter, or a president. The tenements made the case for leaving on their own. Rooms stacked above streets that held the day's heat long past dark. Air that didn't move. Whole families with nowhere to go until September. Sullivan County offered rocky hillsides, poor soil, and distance from all of it. For a family that had spent a decade saving from a pushcart or a sewing machine, cheap hillsides were still hillsides. The ground gave nothing back. Whatever they planted returned less than went in, thin, glacially scraped acreage that earlier farmers had already worked out and walked away from before the immigrant families ever bought it. But a farm that can't feed the family that owns it also can't sit empty. So they rented what they had. A bedroom, a porch, a shelf in the kitchen where a second family could keep its own pots and cook its own dinner under the same roof. The arrangement got a name, the Kuchelen, Yiddish for cook it yourself. A boarding house in the loosest possible sense. No dining room, no staff, no meals. Just a bed and a shared kosher kitchen where every family cooked its own food at its own hour on its own shelf. It was, more or less, the tenement relocated 90 miles into the hills and given a view. The Ontario and Western Railway carried them up, a line that had spent decades hauling coal and milk and now found a more reliable freight riding its cars every June. Whole families with steamer trunks, coming to occupy a rented bed for a summer, riding home again in September. Within a few seasons, the boarders and the farm families had named the whole region themselves. They called it the Borscht Belt, after the beet soup ladled out in nearly every one of those shared kitchens, a joke they told about themselves before anyone outside the mountains had heard it. No founder, no plan. Just farms, families, a railway, and a soup. Selig Grossinger had already failed once running a restaurant in New York when he arrived in Sullivan County in 1914 and bought a rundown farm near Ferndale, the kind of property no city bank would lend against. No partners. No hotel experience. No plan beyond turning one failure into something else before the money ran out. He didn't build a hotel. He rented rooms in the house he already had to boarders expecting nothing grander than a bed and a kitchen shelf. The first ones paid $9 a week. Remember that number. It comes back at the end of this story, in an arrangement of zeros nobody standing on that farm in 1914 could have imagined. His daughter Jenny kept the books before she ever kept the guests, and within a few years had made herself the hostess of a farm her father still ran like a ledger. Then in 1931, the George Washington Bridge opened, and the state paved and widened Route 17 alongside it. Together, they collapsed the drive from Manhattan from most of a day to a few hours behind the wheel of a Ford. Hotels rose to meet the shortened trip. Dozens, then hundreds. Brown's in Loch Sheldrake, the Novelle in Elmville. None of them needed a rail timetable anymore, just a paved road and a full tank. And here's the part that shouldn't work. They kept rising after 1929, while credit vanished from the rest of the American economy. Not because anyone was prospering. A week at a Jacqueline still cost less than a week sweating through August in a tenement, and that math held even as wages collapsed. The Depression didn't shut the Borscht Belt down, it sent more customers. In 1935, a Russian-born barber named Arthur Winterick, who'd made a fortune on a scalp tonic, took a hotel at Kiamesha Lake in settlement of a debt. He'd never asked to run a resort. He rebuilt it in 1937 as the Concorde, and then kept building, every year, for 30 years. By the 1950s, more than 1 million guests filled these two counties every summer. And they didn't arrive as scattered strangers. They arrived as neighborhoods. Whole blocks moved together. Whole buildings emptied together, entire synagogue congregations relocated to the same corner of the mountains for 8 weeks. So a family renting a bungalow in July found half its own apartment building, renting the bungalows on either side. This wasn't tourism. It was closer to seasonal migration. The same neighborhoods reassembling themselves 90 miles from home, year after year, until the mountains had their own version of the streets the guests had left. The city didn't send visitors to the Catskills. It sent itself, one summer at a time. The fathers stayed behind Monday through Thursday, working the jobs that paid for it. Friday evening, they drove. Route 17 filled every week with men who'd spent 5 days alone in a hot apartment, heading north in the last daylight. The traffic became the clock the whole region set its week by, thin on Tuesday, solid by 6 on Friday. Locals had a name for them. Not unkind, just accurate. Bungalow bachelors. What waited at the larger hotels ran on one arrangement, the American plan. 3 meals a day, kosher, enormous, included. Look at what that actually was. The Jacqueline had been 4 families rationing a burner on a schedule chalked above a shared stove. The American plan was that same memory turned inside out and sold back as the entire point of the trip. Nobody cooked. Nobody shared a shelf. Abundance wasn't a feature of the stay. Abundance was the product. Nobody sold it at greater scale than Grossinger's. At its peak, 35 buildings across 1,200 acres, 150,000 guests a year, its own post office, its own airstrip. Seating for 1,300 people eating at once, 3 times a day, all summer. In 1952, it became the first resort in the world to cover a ski slope in artificial snow. Manufacturing in February, the one commodity these mountains had never needed help producing in July. Picture Ferndale on a Friday evening that year. Sedans turning up the drive past a post office already closed, and an airstrip lit by the last of the sun. Dining room windows going bright in blocks as the staff sets 1,300 places. Brisket moving across the lawn on the evening air, a farm no bank would lend against 40 years earlier. What Jenny Grossinger built from her father's ledger was closer to a court, and she was its permanent hostess. Rocky Marciano trained on her grounds, running the mountain roads before dawn, until the resort's name became shorthand in the boxing press for a training camp of real consequence. A teenage Eddie Fisher sang for the guests, and was heard by someone who mattered. A kind of Discovery Catskill hotels would claim for a dozen careers over the next decade, with varying accuracy. Grossinger's had stopped being a place people escaped to. It was a place careers passed through. A few miles down the road at Kiamesha Lake, Winterick was still building. By the 1950s, the Concord covered 2,000 acres, offered 1,500 rooms, and could seat 3,000 people at a single dinner service, enough to make Grossinger's 1,300 look modest. He cut a golf course into the hillside and named it the Monster. The name held. Golfers ranked it among the hardest in the country. A deliberate, engineered cruelty laid into a resort otherwise built entirely on comfort. Every time the Concord ran short of rooms or stage time, Winterick's answer was identical. Another wing, another floor, another act. It didn't grow by plan. It grew by reflex for 30 straight years. Not everyone chased that. In Thompson, the Kutcher family ran their hotel as a single household business, passed down 3 generations without ever changing hands. And it was at Kutcher's in the early 1950s that a lanky Philadelphia teenager carried suitcases for tips, a bellhop, who, in the hours he wasn't working, was unbeatable on the hotel's outdoor court. His name was Wilt Chamberlain. Every hotel of any size also employed a figure the region called the tumbler, from the Yiddish for commotion, whose entire job was keeping guests laughing from the pool deck at 10 in the morning to the nightclub floor past midnight. Because the dining rooms fed 1 million guests a summer, the nightclubs behind them fed something else, an entire generation's sense of what was funny, rehearsed nightly for an audience that had already eaten, had nowhere else to go, and expected to be entertained until the small hours. Sid Caesar picked up a saxophone in a Catskill hotel band as a teenager. Jerry Lewis bussed tables, clearing plates from rooms where his own parents were performing that same evening. Mel Brooks worked the circuit. Joan Rivers worked the circuit. Rodney Dangerfield worked it too, each one sharpening an act in front of the same unforgiving crowd of garment workers and their wives, people who'd paid for comfort and would not sit politely through a joke that missed. These mountains didn't discover comedians. They manufactured them on a nightly schedule in rooms too small to hide a bad set. Comic, then singer, then dancing, then a midnight buffet for guests who'd eaten at 7 and would eat again before bed. 2 shows a night, every night, all season. The lights over Kiamesha Lake didn't go dark before 4 in the morning. Proxine Tortage and Reddens, when they yo quietly, the reasons the Borscht Belt existed began to dissolve. No hotel closed to mark the moment. No headline announced it. Sullivan County historian John Conway later reduced the whole unraveling to 3 words. Each worked on it, and not one of them required a single hotel to fail a single booking before the damage began. Air conditioning came first, bolted into city windows through the 1950s and 60s. For 2 generations, escaping the heat of a Lower East Side walk-up had been the entire premise of the trip north, the reason for the Cuchulainn, the reason for the Friday drive, the reason the migration existed at all. Once a window unit did the same job for a monthly bill, escaping the heat no longer required a mountain. Airfare did the second piece. Cheap jet service put Miami Beach a few hours away, the Caribbean within an afternoon, Europe within reach of a 2-week vacation for families who'd never been able to afford distance. A week in the mountains now had to compete with a week anywhere on Earth, and the Catskills couldn't manufacture an ocean. Assimilation finished it, and this is the part with the bitter symmetry. The same prejudice that once printed no Hebrews or consumptives beside the room rates receded through the middle of the century. The resorts that had built that policy into their advertising began, one by one, to welcome the guests they'd turned away. The Borscht Belt existed because Jewish families were shut out everywhere else. When those doors opened, the reason for a separate resort world walked out through them. Children raised on the American plan, now doctors, lawyers, professors, took their vacations at hotels that had refused their parents a room. And as women entered the workforce through the 1960s and 1970s, the season-long family stay lost the one arrangement that had ever made it possible. Now go back to the ledge. On the morning of January 25th, 1963, the state of New York, which had acquired the derelict Catskill mountain house years earlier, set the empty building on fire and let it burn above the frozen valley. No ceremony, no crowd. A work crew, a match, and a wooden hulk nobody had run as a hotel in decades, standing where Cole and Church had painted. The first resort built in America ended as a controlled burn on a winter morning. By afternoon, there was nothing on the escarpment but the ledge. 6 years later, these mountains drew the largest crowd they ever had, and it had nothing to do with the kosher dining room. In August 1969, 500,000 young people arrived at a dairy farm in Bethel, Sullivan County, for a festival named after a town 40 miles away. They'd come looking for an escape their parents' hotels had never learned how to sell. They found it down the road. The hotels were still standing. What no longer stood was any reason for them to. They went in order. Small first, the 20-room Catskills, which had never installed air conditioning because air conditioning had never been the point. Then the mid-sized houses that filled 100 rooms in 1955 and couldn't fill 40 by 1970. Then, eventually, the famous names. Jenny Groschinger died in 1972 on the grounds of the resort. Her father had opened as a $9 a week boarding house 58 years earlier. She didn't live to see it close. In 1986, the family sold the hotel for $9 million, and the dining room that once set 1,300 places shut for good. $9 a week in 1914, $9 million in 1986. That distance isn't inflation. Inflation doesn't turn a boarding house into 35 buildings across 1,200 acres. It's the entire arc of this story compressed into a coincidence of digits. Nobody arranged the record, simply happens to contain it. 1 year later, a film called Dirty Dancing made a fictional version of these hotels permanent in American memory, playing forever on screen a resort that had already closed before a single frame was shot. The Concorde held out longest. Weinerich's answer to every problem had always been another wing, and the hotel he built that way ran until 1998, outlasting Grossinger's by 12 years on scale alone. It sold at auction in 1999 for roughly $10 million, a fraction of what went into it. It stood empty another decade and came down in 2008. Kutcher's outlasted them both, closing in 2013, the last operating grand resort of the Borscht Belt, run by one family for over a century. The buildings came down the following year. Grossinger's stood empty for 30 years, and in that time became one of the most photographed ruins in the United States, not despite the decay, because of it. The indoor pool with birch trees through the shattered skylight, ballroom's carpeted floor to cornice in moss. Demolition crews leveled the last building on October 19th, 2018. That same year, a casino called Resorts World Catskills opened on the old Concorde grounds, built at a reported cost of $1.2 billion. A bet that gambling could revive what vacationing built and a jet engine unbuilt. And every July, the bungalow colonies fill again. The families are Hasidic and Orthodox now in South Fallsburg in Kiamesha Lake, in Monticello, keeping roughly the same schedule of summer migration that a different set of Jewish families kept a century ago. The hotels that once printed no, Hebrews beside their room rates are gone. The land they stood on belongs, every summer, to the people it was built to keep out. High above the Hudson, The ledge where the mountain house stood for 139 years is bare rock now, inside a state campground. The wind still crosses it the way it crossed those porch columns in 1849. The valley below still vanishes into cloud on a summer morning and returns by noon, exactly as it did for Cole, for Church, for Grant and Arthur and Roosevelt. Every hotel in this story is gone. The view charges nothing and answers to no one. It's the only thing here that never closed. A body sat in the Los Angeles morgue, unclaimed. Days passed. The family name on the file was Hilton. As in the hotel empire, worth hundreds of millions. Nobody came. This is how a Hilton heir died with $10,000 to her name. A daughter without a key. For 67 years, Francesca Hilton lived within arm's reach of one of the greatest fortunes ever assembled in America. She could see it. She could feel its weight. She could not touch it. Her father, Conrad Hilton, had built a hotel empire valued at over $200 million. But the name was not the same as the key, and Francesca never had the key. She was 67 when a stroke claimed her in January 2015. She died with approximately $10,000 to her name. Her body sat in the Los Angeles County morgue, unclaimed, until the CEO of the Conrad Hilton Foundation finally stepped in to handle what her own family would not. There is a particular cruelty in being close to wealth without having access to it. Not poverty, which at least offers the clarity of absence. Not prosperity, which offers the comfort of participation. Something else entirely. A life spent pressing against glass that never breaks, watching warmth and belonging on the other side. Francesca knew the hotels. She knew the people who managed them and the people who profited from them. She had grown up in their lobbies and ballrooms, photographed in their light, carrying the surname across their marble floors. But she was never quite a Hilton in the way that mattered. Not to her father. Not to the courts. Not to the institution that would carry her family's name into perpetuity while leaving her outside its gates. Every story about exclusion begins with the thing that does the excluding. To understand how Francesca came to be shut out, you first have to understand how the walls went up. The man who built the walls. The story begins with Augustus Hilton, a Norwegian immigrant who arrived in America with a name that sounded foreign on every tongue that tried to pronounce it. He settled in the New Mexico territory, in a sun-baked railroad town called San Antonio. Not the one in Texas, but a dusty outpost, where the desert met the tracks, and the tracks met whatever opportunity happened to roll through. Augustus opened a general store. He married. He had children. One of them was a boy named Conrad, born in 1887, who would change everything. Conrad learned early that commerce was not just about selling goods. It was about reading people, about understanding what a man needed before the man knew he needed it. He watched his father extend credit to ranchers during lean seasons and collect when the cattle sold. He watched him board traveling salesmen in the back room when no hotel existed within 50 miles. Every transaction was a lesson. Every customer was a relationship. Every relationship was a future. The boy was not destined for the general store. Conrad left home, served in the army during World War I, and returned with a plan: buy a bank. He found one in Cisco, Texas. He arranged the purchase. He prepared to take possession. The deal fell through. What happened next would become the founding myth of the Hilton Empire, repeated in boardrooms and biographies for decades. Stranded in Cisco, with the purchase collapsed and his plans in ruins, Conrad walked down the street and found the Mobley Hotel. The Mobley was not grand. It was a 2-story brick building near the railroad depot, catering to oil field workers and traveling salesmen who needed a bed for the night and not much more. The lobby was small. The rooms were smaller. But every bed was filled. Conrad stood in that lobby and saw what the bank would never have shown him. He saw turnover. He saw demand. He saw a business where the inventory emptied and refilled every 24 hours. He bought the Mobley Hotel instead. Within months, Conrad had transformed it. He raised rates, added rooms, turned the cramped lobby into a social hub where guests lingered. The Mobley made money faster than any bank could have. More importantly, it gave him a template. He began acquiring hotels across Texas, each one a variation on the same formula. Find a town where people needed a place to stay. Buy the building. Make it better. Move on to the next one. The Great Depression came and stripped millions of Americans of everything they had built. But Conrad held on, restructuring his debts, negotiating with creditors, and keeping his properties running through the worst economic collapse in modern history. Until he emerged not just intact but expanding. The empire was built. The name was made. Conrad Hilton, son of a Norwegian shopkeeper, had become one of the most powerful hoteliers in America. But the man who could read a stranger's needs across a lobby counter could not read the woman he would marry, and the daughter that marriage produced would spend her entire life standing outside doors that bore her own last name. A marriage of opposites. Sasa Gabor was everything Conrad Hilton's world was not. Born in Budapest, trained in the European arts, she carried herself with the glamour of a continent that measured a woman's worth in wit, jewelry, and the men who could provide both. Conrad was a Catholic from New Mexico who attended Mass every morning and believed a woman's place was in the home he provided. She believed a woman's place was wherever the light was brightest. That distance would not be bridged by a wedding ring. They married in 1942, and the union operated more as a transaction than a partnership. Conrad had the money and the name. Zisa had the beauty and social access no hotel revenue could buy. For a time, the arrangement held. But Conrad's idea of marriage was a chain of command, not a collaboration. He controlled the finances, the schedule, the household. He expected the same discipline he applied to his hotels. Zisa was theatrical, impulsive, out late, spending lavishly, collecting admirers. Whether any became something more remains disputed, but Conrad believed they had. And for a man of his temperament, belief was sufficient. The marriage buckled, then it broke. Francesca Hilton was born in 1947 into a union already coming apart. Gabor would later allege that Francesca's conception had been non-consensual. A claim never proven in court, but one that attached itself to the child's origin story like a stain no money could remove. They divorced that same year. Conrad walked away with his empire intact. Zisa walked toward the cameras, reinventing herself as one of the most recognizable women in the world. Conrad's response to the divorce was colder than any legal decree. He did not simply end his marriage. He erased the daughter it produced. Francesca's name appeared on the birth certificate, unambiguously his. But Conrad treated her existence as a clerical error, a line item he preferred to leave unreconciled. He would father other children, build other legacies. Francesca would remain the one he could not bring himself to claim. Growing up as decoration, the world Francesca entered in 1947 was already coming apart, and the timing proved prophetic. A life of privilege perpetually shadowed by emotional isolation. Her childhood was defined by motion, packed into cars and onto planes, ferried between cities and continents, between equestrian competitions, where audiences saw a beautiful girl on a beautiful animal and asked nothing more of her. Zikabor understood the world as a stage. She understood her daughter as a prop, not without love. Cesar loved Francesca in the way that people love things that reflect well on them. Proudly, possessively, conditionally. Francesca was dressed for photographs before she could choose her own clothes. She was seated beside her mother at dinner parties, where Hollywood producers held court, at nightclubs where the guest list doubled as a ledger of power and access. She was introduced, admired, paraded. A beautiful daughter with the Hilton name and the Gabor face was the ultimate accessory in a life built entirely on accessories. Zizi Zar had survived her own wars. The kind fought in European drawing rooms and Hollywood back lots. And she had emerged with a conviction that never wavered. Beauty was currency, display was strategy, and a daughter who could turn heads was a daughter who was earning her keep. Francesca also endured the dangerous edges of her mother's orbit, left to navigate the company of men whose interest in a famous woman's child was never entirely innocent, while her father remained a cold, distant figure on the horizon. Then the script broke. Francesca pushed back against the role that had been written for her. The decorative daughter, the equestrian trophy, the living accent to Zizazar's ensemble. And she did it in the most direct way available. She went to work at the Beverly Hilton, her father's hotel, the crown jewel of his California holdings. She did not arrive as a Hilton. She arrived as an employee. She showed up. She did the work. She earned a paycheck and a place in the building that bore her last name. And for the first time in her life, she was valued for what she could do, rather than how she looked doing it. Conrad noticed, not with warmth, but with something that passed for respect in his limited emotional vocabulary. Their relationship settled into a pattern that would hold for decades, distant but affectionate, constrained but real, always separated by the wall between his empire and anyone who might lay claim to it. That wall would hold. Until the day he decided what each of his children was worth. The number he assigned her. Conrad Hilton died on January 3rd, 1979. His estate was valued at approximately $200 million. In his final act as patriarch, he assigned each of his children a number. The foundation would receive the bulk of his fortune. His sons would receive bequests structured to keep them tethered to the empire. Francesca would receive $100,000, not a percentage, not a trust, not a seat at the table, or a role in the company, or a key to any door she had spent her life standing outside of, a flat sum. The kind of figure a man arrives at not through carelessness, but through deliberation. The cold arithmetic of a father calculating what one daughter was worth, and committing that number to a document that would outlast him. She was furious. She contested the will, hired attorneys, argued the disinheritance reflected the influence of those around her father in his declining years. The court disagreed. The will stood exactly as written, and $100,000 became not a gift, but a verdict. Permanent, enforceable, final. Then Baron, her half-brother, looked at the same will and saw what she could not. He contested it, and won, substantially enough to reclaim operational control of the empire. Same courts, same probate process. But Baron had something Francesca did not: a position within the company, allies on the board, leverage that had nothing to do with birthright, and everything to do with institutional power. That was the real lesson buried in the will. Francesca's exclusion was not a matter of legal merit. It was a matter of power, and she had none. Baron could fight his way back inside because he already had one foot through the door. Francesca could not, because Conrad had never let her inside at all. The irony would calcify over the years. Conrad's foundation, nourished by the fortune shielded from his own daughter, grew into a multi-billion-dollar philanthropy dedicated to housing the homeless. The Hotel King's money would roof the heads of strangers, while his daughter began the slow descent toward a future that looked nothing like the one her surname had promised. Finding her own name, the $100,000 would not last long. What she built after it was gone would be entirely her own. For better and for worse. She turned first to acting, and in 1971 she made her debut in Henry Jaglam's A Safe Place, sharing the screen with Jack Nicholson and Tuesday Weld. It was a small part in a small film, but it was hers. Ean through an audition, not a surname. 2 years later came an uncredited role as a shoplifter in the blaxploitation thriller Cleopatra Jones, followed by a bit part in The Gravy Train in 1974. Television offered scraps too, a guest appearance on Cannon. And years later, small roles in Liz, The Elizabeth Taylor Story, Pterodactyl Woman from Beverly Hills, and Forever Fabulous. None of it added up to stardom. None of it was meant to. Nearly 3 decades of scattered credits, and still the trade papers would identify her the same way every time. Not as an actress, but as a Hilton, as a Gabor, as the daughter of someone else's fame. Photography offered what acting could not, a position behind the lens instead of in front of it. Through the 1980s, she picked up a camera and worked as a publicist, learning the machinery of celebrity from its unglamorous underside. At the pitch calls, the placements, the images built and managed for other people's benefit. She had spent her childhood as the subject of other people's photographs. Now she decided who got photographed, and how, and why. It was not fame. It was not fortune. But it was authorship, however modest, over a life that had rarely been her own to direct. The fight for her mother. Frederick von Anhalt had married Zsa Gabor in 1986. Her 9th husband, and the last man who would hold legal authority over her affairs. As Ziza's health declined, von Anhalt positioned himself as the gatekeeper to everything she owned. Francesca was not trying to claim her mother's estate. She was trying to see her mother, to confirm the woman who had once paraded her through countless flashbulb-drenched lobbies was being cared for by someone whose interests extended beyond the inheritance. Von Anhalt saw a threat, and he responded with everything he had. What followed was not a custody dispute. It was a legal war. Von Anhalt accused Francesca of stealing from her own mother, off-raiding Caesar Haug-Krauns, of exploiting her deteriorating mental state, of treating a dying woman as a financial opportunity. The accusations were specific. They were public. And they were calculated to do exactly what they did: cut Francesca off from her mother. During the years when that separation would cause the most damage, Francesca had grown up in a world where people performed love for cameras. She understood how accusations functioned in Hollywood. Not as instruments of justice, but as weapons of narrative control. Von Anhalt was not filing lawsuits to recover stolen property. He was filing lawsuits to construct a story. The daughter was predatory. The husband was the guardian. The mother needed protection from her own flesh and blood. Every filing reinforced the frame. Every press leak sharpened it. The stage that couldn't disinherit her. C found the stage. Not the kind her mother had commanded. Not camera crews and diamonds, but a small room with a microphone and strangers who had paid to laugh. Stand-up comedy became her cathartic lifeline. She stood before audiences and told them what her family had done to her. Conrad's coldness. Caesar's vanity. The will that left her $100,000 from a $200 million fortune. The stepfather who accused her of stealing from her own mother. Every joke was a wound rearranged into a punchline. It was the one place where no one could disinherit her, silence her, or pretend she had never been born. By her final years, despite her lineage, Francesca was enduring poverty that neither the Hilton fortune nor the Gabor glamour had prepared her to survive. Then she suffered a stroke. She was 67. She died in a Los Angeles hospital. The same city where she had been born into one of the most famous families in the world. Her body was taken to the county morgue, where it sat, unclaimed, day after day. No sibling came forward. No relative arrived. Her mother, confined to a bed and isolated by Frederick von Anhalt, would not have known her daughter was gone. It was the CEO of the Conrad Hilton Foundation who finally stepped in. Not a Hilton. Not a Gabor. An administrator of the very foundation her father had built, to ensure his wealth went everywhere except to his own daughter. The days her body spent unclaimed were not a twist of fate. They were the final, literal expression of a life that had been lived exactly this way from the beginning. The name lives on. The Hilton name did not die with Francesca. It could not. Names like that don't simply fade. They find new faces, new markets, new ways of meaning something entirely different from what came before. Paris Hilton was Conrad's great-granddaughter, born to the same baron who had fought to reclaim the empire Francesca was shut out of. And she arrived in the public consciousness not through hotels or philanthropy or business acumen, but through nightclubs, red carpets, and a reality television camera crew that followed her every move. The Simple Life premiered in 2003, and the Hilton name was reborn as spectacle. Not hospitality, not luxury, not service or ambition or frontier grit, but a brand built on the radical proposition that attention itself was the product. She launched fragrances, clothing lines, television deals, endorsement contracts, and licensing agreements that stretched across continents, constructing a retail empire that generated over $1 billion in revenue. Every dollar flowing from a name her great-grandfather had forged in brick-and-mortar and frontier ambition. She was mocked and dismissed and treated as a punchline, a cautionary tale. But the money never stopped. Proof that for the Hilton name in the modern era, there was no such thing as bad publicity. Francesca had died with $10,000 to her name. Her body was claimed not by family, but by an administrator of her father's foundation.